Welcome, my friends. Tonight, let's leave the present behind, gently, slowly, like a boat drifting away from the shore at dusk. The world is quiet now. The screens are dark, the door is closed, and beyond it lies a time not our own, a time of shadows, of silence, of smoke curling from the last fire in a forgotten village. We are going back, nearly 700 years, to a chapter of history that still echoes in our blood, whether we remember it or not. This is the story of the Black Death. So, get comfortable. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath match the rhythm of this tale. And if this journey brings you calm, insight, or a kind of quiet wonder, I hope you'll like this video, share it with a fellow traveler, and subscribe to join us again. Leave a comment too, if you'd like. I read every word, and your thoughts keep these stories alive. Now, close your eyes if you wish, because tonight, we're slipping into a world where everything was about to change. Imagine this. One evening, your neighbor sits down for supper. He laughs. He lifts a cup to his lips. His children are playing outside. By dawn, he is gone. And not just him. The family across the street, the old woman who sold bread on the corner, the priest, the midwife, the man who carried news from the next town. Within days, your village falls silent. The air changes, the light dims, a cart rolls slowly down the lane, not filled with grain or goods, but with bodies. No one speaks of it at first, the cough, the black swellings, the blood on the lips. But the silence grows to heavy. Something ancient has awakened. They called it many things: the great mortality, God's punishment, the end of days. We call it the Black Death, a name that still trembles in the corners of old churches and crumbling tombs. It began far from Europe, in the open wilds of Central Asia, where marmots hibernate in silence beneath the earth. There, in the hidden places, a germ stirred. Yersinia pestis, an invisible shadow, ancient and unspeakably efficient. It lived in the blood of rodents. Then it jumped, first to fleas, then to people. And when it learned to live in our lungs, it burned across the world. The roads of empire carried it like wind. Mongol riders galloped across the steppe, bearing news, orders, spices, and death. Caravans wound through the Silk Road. Fleas nestled in blankets. Plague boarded ships. And so it came, not with a roar, but with a cough, a fever, a sudden, breathless silence. From 1346 to 1353, the Black Death moved like a ghost. It took one in every 3 people in Europe, millions upon millions of lives. Cities emptied, churches filled with corpses. The air reeked of ash and fear. Fields lay fallow. Bells tolled endlessly, until there was no one left to ring them. Gravediggers died before their holes were filled. Children buried their parents. Then no one remained to bury the children. People began to believe the world had ended. And in many ways, it had. But this is not only a story of numbers and death. It is also a story of whispers, of prayers muttered in the dark, of love that endured even as the body failed. It is the story of monks who stayed beside the dying, of women who sang lullabies to fevered children, of neighbors who placed bread at the doors of the sick and never came back to collect thanks. It is a story of endings and strange, unthinkable beginnings. So tonight, as you lie in the quiet of your own time, let the distant past come softly to you. Let the candle burn low in the corners of your mind. Let the winds of history pass over you like a shiver in the night. And remember, there was a time, not so long ago, when the world fell silent, and when it woke again. It was not the same. This is the beginning of our tale, the Black Death, and the 4 dark stars that lit the sky before the world unraveled. Asterisk chapter. The first cough. Land was still, not silent. No, for there is never silence on the high steppe. The wind hummed through the dry grasses, whispering over the low hills like an old woman mumbling to herself. Insects clicked beneath stones. Distant hooves beat faintly across the dust, trailing the shadows of nomads and herds. But in the spaces between those sounds, there was a waiting stillness, as if the earth was holding its breath. It was the year 1345, or so the monks would later try to mark it. But here, beneath the sky of Central Asia, dates meant little. The sun rose, the marmots stirred in their burrows, and men hunted. Batu, A weary man with skin like leather and eyes always squinting against the sun, crouched behind a ridge of stone. He had watched this marmot den for hours, silent as frost. His bowstring was taut. His fingers ached from the cold. And still he waited. Marmots were fat this year. Strange, perhaps, for early spring, and though they moved slowly after their long sleep underground, they were wily. You had to know how they breathed, where they paused, what sound meant they'd scented you. Then, movement. A small shape waddled out of the den entrance, blinking in the sunlight. Batchu did not breathe. His arrow flew without sound. The marmot gave a single shriek, then collapsed. Later, as he skinned the animal with practiced hands, Batchu paused. The marmot's blood was dark, thicker than usual. He had opened its belly and found the organs swollen, slick with some blackened fluid that clung to his knife. He spat on the ground, frowning. Disease, perhaps, a sick animal. He should throw the carcass away. But food was food, and the fur was good. Winter had been long, and the traders in the south paid well for marmot pelts. He wiped his blade on the grass and said nothing. By nightfall, Batu's campfire crackled beneath a stunted pine. Smoke rose into the blue-dark sky, curling beneath stars like chipped bone. He ate stew from a clay bowl. The marmot's meat boiled soft, though it tasted off, bitter at the back of the tongue. He pulled his furs tighter. The wind was cold tonight. The first cough came just before dawn. Dry, harmless. He thought little of it. But by the next night, it had grown deeper. His chest felt tight, his limbs heavy. Still, he rode to the next valley, trading a few pelts to another hunter, exchanging murmurs about weather, horses, and the strange dull-eyed marmots. He wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, two others had begun to cough. One spat blood. Another was found in the grass beside his tent, face down, his lips black. They buried him quickly, stacking stones over his body, muttering short prayers. Without looking at each other, the earth was still frozen just beneath the surface. The air smelled strange. That night, the wind did not blow. The campfires burned low. Something moved in the dark, not animal, not wind. A silence that pressed against the skin. Far from this valley, across the open plains and frozen rivers, caravans moved slowly along the old Silk Road. Mongol riders thundered past them, bound for outposts and garrisons, their horses foaming with sweat. No one stopped long in these highlands, but sometimes they camped, sometimes they shared food or stories or furs or blood. One of those riders coughed as he passed through the Issyk Basin. He felt fine, mostly, just a sore throat. He didn't mention it. 2 days later, his servant could not rise from the tent floor. 3 more were taken ill by sunset. By the time they reached the military post in the west, half the company had developed a strange fever. Some began bleeding from the mouth. Still, they rode. Later, when the monks tried to trace the plague's origin, they would find the graves. A Nestorian Christian cemetery near the lake, quiet and crumbling, with markers scratched in Syriac and Turkish. All the headstones bore the same year, 1338, a decade before Europe knew what was coming. They had no answers, only stone, only bones. Back in the valley, Batchu lay inside his yurt, wrapped in wool and breathless. His eyes stared upward, unfocused, watching the shadows flicker against the ceiling. His hands trembled. The buboes beneath his arms had ruptured, weeping black fluid. His mouth was dry, but he no longer asked for water. The fever had taken his voice. At the edge of the firelight, his wife knelt beside him, whispering prayers to the wind. She did not touch him, but she did not leave. When the sun rose, he was still. That evening, she built a pyre of dry pine branches. No one came to help her. The other families had fled the valley, driving their animals westward. She watched the smoke rise until it vanished into the night. Then she turned away and began to walk. And so it began, not with fire, not with battle, not with screams or omens in the sky, but with a breath, drawn and never exhaled. With a cough that echoed through the quiet hills, with blood on a blade and a name forgotten, with the dying eyes of a marmot blinking in the spring sun, and a wind that carried more than smoke. Spring advanced across the steppe, quietly and without joy. the grasses turned green, but the birds seemed fewer. In the marmot fields, no children played. Where once fires smoked in the morning chill, only cold ashes remained. The yurts were empty now, skins flapping in the wind like sails on a ship, without crew. But the trade roads did not sleep. No matter what died in the valleys, empire kept moving. The Mongol world, vast and terrifying, pulsed with motion. Horse relays, like veins in a living body, stretched from China to Persia, from the black cliffs of the Caspian to the yellow plains of Mongolia. The messengers of the great Khan rode with pouches tied tight to their saddles and dust crusted in their teeth. Orders passed swiftly. Grain moved by cartload. Silk and spices crossed deserts. The empire was a wheel, and nothing, not snow, not wolves, not even the ghost of death, would stop its turning. And so it carried something new. Something small, something invisible, but more faithful than any soldier. Meanwhile, in the high passes above Persia, a merchant caravan wound slowly down a stony trail. The wagons groaned beneath crates of cloth and jars of oil. Mules grunted. Men swore under their breath. Wrapped against the cold, one man, a Syrian from Aleppo, coughed for much of the descent. The others gave him herbs, wine, advice. Altitude, they said, nothing more. But 2 of them would fall within a week. Another began to bleed from the nose. His hands turned blue. Still, the wagons rolled onward. There were buyers waiting. In the cities of the West, dead men do not make sales. In a Nestorian Christian monastery near Lake Issyk, the bells stopped ringing. The brothers kept careful records in their stone chapel, scratching the names of the departed into ledgers, thick with dust. The pages turned black with ink and sorrow. 30, then 60, then hundreds. They could not bury the dead fast enough. And when the abbot began to bleed from the eyes, they sealed the chapel doors and prayed without speaking. A year later, Russian explorers would uncover those graves, scattered and sunken, and mark the start of something vast. The wind blew on. It carried the scent of juniper and smoke, and something else. It passed through Tashkent and into Samarkand. It wound through alleyways in Kashgar, past sleeping children and flickering lanterns. It kissed the cheeks of the living and the dying without distinction. It was not cruel. It simply moved, and with it, so did death. In a Genos outpost on the Black Sea, the port city of Kaffa, rats skittered between crates of grain. Fleas, bloated and blind, crawled across wool and rope. On one ship's hull, a stain the size of a man's hand had begun to spread. The men aboard that vessel didn't yet know. They were already dead. They would set sail by week's end. The first cough was long past. Now came the fever, the swelling, the blood, and behind it, in the gathering dusk, the soft fall of silence across the world. Chapter 2. Kaffa, the Siege of Death. Kaffa sat by the sea, a crooked gem on the Black Sea's southern rim. Its harbor gleamed under the early summer sun, sails bobbing in the breeze. The scent of brine and spice thick in the air. The walls, built of old stone and guarded by Genos mercenaries, were said to be impenetrable. And yet, something had entered, not by force nor fire, but through a crack no one saw. A breath, a flea, a grain sack left too long in the sun. The siege had begun the previous autumn. The Mongol army had come fast and angry, like a storm rolling down from the hills. They laid camp beyond the walls and waited, sending arrows into the sky and curses across the wind. The Genos inside jeered at first. Kaffa had stood against worse. Its gates were thick, its gods many, its people armed. But by the new moon, something had changed. The arrows slowed. The drums stopped. The smoke from the Mongol fires no longer drifted in the wind. And one morning, a soldier on the wall squinted toward the enemy camp and saw only stillness. Men lying motionless, horses collapsed in their reins, the tents fluttering like skins, drying on a rack. No battle had taken place, but they were dying all the same. It began with a few, a cough, a collapse, black swellings at the neck. Then the Mongol commanders did something no one had done before. They gathered their dead, dozens, then hundreds, and heaved them over the walls. Rotting corpses flew through the air like meat flung to wolves, thudding onto the cobblestones below. Eyes glassy, mouths agape, arms twisted mid-spasm. At first, the Genos laughed. Then they burned the bodies. Then they wept. Within a week, the first signs appeared in the city. A baker fell face first into his flour. A merchant's wife coughed blood onto her silks, staining them black. Children who played by the docks vanished into shuttered rooms, their screams muffled by blankets and prayers. Physicians wore beaked masks and burned rosemary in the streets. Priests paraded with crosses, whipping themselves bloody in the square, begging for mercy. But nothing stopped it. The wind had shifted, and death had passed through the gates without knocking. One sailor, a boy of 19, hid beneath the docks for 2 days after his master died in front of him. He said the body convulsed, then sat upright one last time, staring with wide, blackened eyes. The boy left that night, boarding a ship for Sicily. He coughed as the vessel passed into open water. So did the others. In the harbor, rats poured from the holds. Some were already dead, their bellies bloated, mouths bloody. Fleas crawled in carpets along the ropes and gangplanks. The sea took the ships one by one, bearing them like funeral barges. To Sicily, then Genoa, then Marseilles, and finally Europe. Back in Caffa, the air thickened. Smoke from pyres never cleared. Bells rang so often they cracked. Streets were slick with ash and fluid, and dogs howled endlessly in the hills beyond. Some said they saw angels walking the rooftops, not with wings, but with hollow eyes and mouths sewn shut. Others saw shadows where there were no men. One monk wrote in his final letter, "We do not dream here anymore. We only remember, and even that is fading." The Genos who could still walk fled to the ships. They did not know that their bones would rest in foreign soil or at the bottom of the sea. They only knew one thing: the world was breaking, and the sea, though dark and endless, still seemed kinder than the land. But death was already aboard, wrapped in cloth, clinging to lashes, breathing in the belly of the ship. And Europe, far on the horizon, slept in peace. For now. Chapter 3. The first city's fall. The sea was calm that morning. Sailcloth fluttered gently above the ships as they drifted into Messina's harbor, the sun casting gold across their decks. From the dockside, they seemed ordinary. Foreign vessels were not unusual. The city was a bright hub in the kingdom of Sicily, a crossroads of trade, of language, of coin and pilgrimage. But the men aboard those ships did not wave. They did not speak. They did not rise. The harbor master approached with caution. The silence was wrong. He climbed onto the nearest ship and found only the creak of timber and the stink of rot. Below deck, the air was thick, unbreathable. Crates of goods sat unopened. In one corner, a man lay curled beneath a blanket, eyes wide, unmoving. His skin was purple, his jaw frozen mid-gasp. The harbor master staggered back and fell to his knees. That night, the wind changed. By morning, Messina was infected. They tried to contain it. They always tried. The governor sent men to close the ports, too late. Priests lit candles, ringing bells and muttering Latin until their voices broke. A noblewoman paid handsomely to have her villa sealed, all 20. Servants died inside before the week's end. The plague was not interested in gold, nor in titles, nor in prayers. It came for all. From Messina, it spread like hunger. To Catania, then Palermo, then across the straits to Calabria, licking at the boots of the Apennines. In every town, the pattern was the same: a cough, a fever, swellings in the armpits, groin, or neck, black and tight and full of death. Then blood, from the nose, the eyes, the lungs. Then silence. Many died in one night, some within hours. Others lived long enough to bury their children and then lie beside them. In Florence, a scribe wrote, "I held my brother's hand and counted his breaths until they stopped. I turned to call for help, but there was no one left. Even the dogs have gone." Doctors wandered the streets in robes of waxed fabric, faces hidden behind long beaked masks filled with dried herbs. Their boots left dark tracks in the dust. They carried staffs to prod the infected, or to push open doors they dared not touch. But they could not cure it. They could not even slow it. By the time the plague reached Pisa, people had already begun to flee, not just from the city, but from one another. Parents abandoned children. Priests locked their churches. Friends crossed the street when they saw one another coming. No one trusted the living anymore. And those who stayed began to whisper that it was a curse, that the air was poisoned, that the Jews had tainted the wells, that this was the end foretold in the book of Revelation. Bonfires were lit, not just of bodies, but of books, of people. Some towns turned to rage, others to repentance. Flagellants roamed barefoot, whipping themselves bloody through the streets, crying out for God to spare them. But God was silent, and the rats kept running. In Marseille, ships burned in the harbor, set alight by desperate officials, but it was too late. The sickness had already walked ashore, smiling behind the faces of sailors. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI consecrated the entire Rhine River as holy ground so that the dead, too many to bury, could be thrown into the water with dignity. One by one, the cities of Europe fell quiet, and still the people moved, fleeing north, fleeing west, fleeing inward, into castles, into monasteries, into themselves. But the plague was already waiting. It was behind every door, in every touch. The year was 13 for 8. And the world was beginning to end. Chapter 4. The vanishing. What do you hear when the world begins to vanish? Not screams, not fire, not even the hoof beat of armies. Only the wind, only footsteps, stopping mid-stride, only the rustle of cloth as a body is turned over in the street. In Paris, they lit fires in the marketplaces to purify the air. The smoke rose in blue-gray spirals, soft and useless. Doctors fled the city, leaving behind empty clinics and unanswered doors. Scholars locked themselves inside monasteries, transcribing scripture with trembling hands. And in the Sorbonne, one professor died at his desk, mid-sentence, a red line of blood curving beneath his chin like an ink stroke. By spring, more than half the population was gone. But Paris was not alone. In the fields beyond Bruges, entire villages lay silent, windows open to the rain. Pigs wandered through empty churches. Chickens roosted atop altars. In one cottage, a priest's robes still hung on a nail, stiff with blood at the cuffs. A local gravedigger, once paid in copper, now refused to bury for less than silver. 2 weeks later, he died with a shovel in his hand, his mouth open wide as if to swallow the sky. The Rhine ran red in places. In Strasbourg, mobs turned inward. Jews, blamed for the plague, were dragged from their homes, chained in groups, and burned. Children watched from behind shutters, clutching dolls that would outlive them. The fire smoked for days. But the plague did not stop. It does not care who is guilty, only who is near. And so the rhythm of death continued. Not a bang, not a blaze, but a soft unraveling. One person, then 5, then 50, until a town's name became just a word, until its church became just a ruin, until its stories became just wind. Letters stopped arriving. Markets stopped opening. The bell ringers were dead, and the bells grew cold. Time bent strangely now. A single day could stretch like a shadow, endless and gray. A week could vanish without a trace, and memory blurred. Who had died? Who had fled? Had they ever truly lived here? Even the dogs stopped barking. In the Alps, snow fell early. Entire hamlets were buried, not by the storm, but by silence. The only signs of life were footprints that led to a door and did not return. Inside, a family sat at table, still upright, food untouched, their eyes open to eternity. The survivors, few as they were, began to distrust the sun. For every clear morning brought another death. People walked with faces covered, bodies swathed in vinegar-soaked linens. They tied herbs to their belts and painted crosses on their doors. Some fled to the mountains, building huts far from the roads. Others shut themselves in basements, reading by candlelight, praying until their voices cracked. But the plague found them. Always. It did not knock. It simply entered. A letter from Cologne read, "There is no bread. There are no horses. The city speaks only in whispers. I have buried everyone. I remain, not out of courage, but confusion. I do not know where to go." Even kings were afraid now. In Bohemia, the court disbanded. In Hungary, royal coffers were spent not on war, but on Lime for the dead. One noble, a count near Krakow, ordered his entire estate sealed. No one in, no one out. Guards stood at the gate with orders to kill even the birds that landed on the walls. When they finally opened the doors 2 months later, everyone inside was dead. Everyone. Across the continent, an old fear returned, that the stars themselves had changed, that the air had turned traitor, that perhaps the earth had grown tired of her children. But the truth was quieter than myth. The truth rode in the blood. It fed on warmth. It slipped through cloth. It bred in the shadow of the flea. And when it reached the lungs, it became breath. And breath became death. This was not the end of the world, but it was the end of a world. The world where you knew your neighbor's name, where bells rang for weddings and for birth, where a town might last 1,000 years and be remembered. Now, they vanished, without graves, without songs, without even a sigh. The black wind moved north. And Europe, broken and breathless, waited for the next knock on the door. Chapter 5. A new map of Death Sea brought it quietly. In the summer of 1348, a merchant ship sailed into Melcombe Regis, a quiet Dorset port wrapped in salt and wind. It docked without fanfare. No cries, no warning. Just sailors with pale skin and trembling hands. By the time the town crier learned their names, they were already dead. Within the week, England began to sicken. The disease did not roar like fire. It whispered. In the breath of a groom, in the cough of a nun, in the black swellings beneath the arms of a child who had kissed his sister goodnight. From Dorset, it traveled inland, through hedgerows and pastures, down muddy tracks and merchant trails. No town was too small, no castle too high, no village too poor to be overlooked. It moved like a shadow falling across parchment. By autumn, the Black Death had reached London. London, that ancient hive of faith and trade, trembled. The bells rang. At first, then too often, then not at all. Churchyards overflowed. The earth was too wet to dig. Graves lay open for days, waiting for hands to carry the next body. But the gravediggers had collapsed beside their spades. In 1 week alone, 7,000 perished. Monks locked their abbey doors. Markets stood abandoned. The king's court fled west, carrying relics and holy water. But death had already packed itself inside their baggage. It wasn't just bodies that died. It was structure. The village reeve no longer enforced the tithe. The blacksmith stopped shaping horseshoes. The miller left his wheel still, the grain turning to rot. At harvest time, the fields stood tall and golden, untouched, unnaturally perfect, because there was no one left to swing the scythe. One priest wrote from Kent, "I have seen 500 souls in 1 month brought to the Lord. And now, there are no more souls, only silence." The church strained beneath the weight. Its rites were made for a world of death with dignity. A candle lit, a priest summoned, a prayer read softly over cooling hands. But now the dying outnumbered the prayers. Last rites were mumbled from doorways. Mass graves swallowed sinners and saints alike. Holy water ran dry. And so, faith began to crack. Some turned more devout, kneeling for hours until their knees bled. Others laughed at the sky, drank, stole, and sinned as if tomorrow were a myth. A new religion of despair began to bloom. Then, something stranger still began to happen. The rich died, not just peasants, not just the poor huddled outside the manor gates, but lords, ladies, scribes, abbots, judges, scholars, merchants, and kings. Inheritance passed too quickly to be recorded. The legal system collapsed under the weight of unanswered claims. Manors stood ownerless. Fields grew wild. In some places, the forests began to return. A child in Northumberland was found wandering alone, caked in ash, muttering his mother's name. No one ever found the house he had left. A knight, delirious and dying, rode straight into the sea, shouting that heaven was west of Ireland. A convent in Lincoln emptied overnight. Its gates were never opened again. And still, the map changed. Villages vanished literally, erased from record. No census, no ruins, no stories passed down. Just a dot on an old monk's scroll, blurred by time and forgotten. Places once full of laughter and harvest and firelight became no more than a name. And then not even that. In 1350, when the first winds of retreat began to stir, When the death toll slowed and the air felt lighter, what remained was not relief, it was ruin. The Black Death had not simply taken lives, it had rewritten the rules of life itself. What did it mean to be holy if priests had fled? What did it mean to own land if all your serfs were dead? What did it mean to be a father if all your children now slept in the earth? In a crumbling house near Canterbury, an old woman sat by her fire, alone. She whispered stories to herself of festivals and saints' days, and of a boy she once kissed in the fields. She had not spoken to another soul in 40 days outside. The sky turned gray inside. Her candle guttered and then silence. But even silence was not the end. Not yet. Chapter 6. What was left behind. The wind had changed. Not the sharp wind of sickness, but a deeper cold, a spiritual cold where no candle, no prayer, no fire could reach. The year was 1353. The plague had retreated, not defeated, only tired, and like a wave, it slipped back into the sea it came from, leaving behind a landscape not of ash, but of absence. The silence now was colder than before. In the forests outside Siena, you could walk for miles without hearing a human voice. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if even the birds had forgotten their songs. An old man sat by a dry well, eyes fixed on the horizon. He had buried his wife, then his son, then the boy's dog. He no longer wept. He no longer prayed. He simply watched, as if waiting for the earth to speak again, it never did. In England, snow came early that year. It crept through broken windows, sifted across church floors where no feet had passed in months, settled upon the altar cloth like dust on a forgotten relic. In Norwich, a cathedral stood open, not from welcome, but from neglect. Its doors had rotted off the hinges, the stained glass cracked by frost. Inside, the bones of 3 monks lay frozen in the choir, their hands still clasped as though the mass had never ended. A rat ran over the chalice. No one chased it. And there was the smell. Not the stench of rot that had faded, but a thinner, lonelier odor of mildew, of burnt wood, of damp cloth never washed. The kind of smell that lives in rooms left undisturbed by breath or laughter. A ghostly scent, carried by the wind like an accusation. In a village near the Rhine, the last surviving woman kept her dead husband's boots by the fire. She knew he would never return. But each night, she placed them near the hearth, and each morning, she dusted off the soot. No one came to visit. No one knew her name. The village had once held 60 souls. Now there were 2, and one of them no longer spoke. The horror of the plague had been swift, but the cold of survival was slower, deeper. No one knew how to live. Now, feasts felt obscene. Laughter was brittle. Even marriage, once the beginning of hope, became quiet, practical, hollow. Children were no longer named after saints or grandparents. They were named after numbers, seasons, weather. Too many names had been lost. Why give a child a name that death would claim by spring? And then there were the hauntings, not by spirits, but by memories. The smell of mother's stew in a kitchen long collapsed, the echo of singing in an abandoned chapel, the print of a child's hand on a shutter, perfectly preserved in dried blood, and dust. People walked past their own homes without entering. They couldn't bear the warmth of memory meeting the coldness of now. The ground itself had changed. Where once wheat grew, now nettles climbed over forgotten tombstones. Where once paths had been clear, now thickets blocked the way, as though the world had decided to close itself, to swallow what had passed. Some survivors began to believe the land itself was cursed. Others believed God had left. In Avignon, the Pope declared a new year of forgiveness, but few came to confess. What is sin? When death has walked through every door. What is salvation? When the priests have all been buried with their robes. The church had no answers. So people turned inward, not to community, but to self. A strange new quiet faith grew in the ashes, not built on hope, but on endurance. The world had grown quieter, but not more peaceful. It was not peace, it was emptiness. The kind of silence that pressed against your ribs when you lay awake at night. The kind of silence that made you question if the sun would rise. The kind of silence that was not the absence of sound, but the absence of meaning. And in that silence, those who remained drifted. They worked the fields because no one else would. They spoke less because who was left to answer? They lived not for the future. There was none, but for the day, for the warmth of the sun when it shone, for the feeling of bread against the tongue, for the rare sound of a bird's wing breaking the wind. The cold was still there, but so were they. Chapter 7. The world reborn in shadow. At first, there was only motion, not joy, not rebuilding, just motion. A rake lifted in the field, a child crying from hunger, a cartwheel creaking in the distance. These small things felt miraculous, because for a time the world had forgotten how to move. And now, like a ghost awakening in its own bones, life began to stir. But it was not the same life. The people who emerged from their homes, from crypts of wood and stone and prayer, were not the people who had gone in. They walked with wider eyes. They spoke more softly. They had the stillness of those who had sat beside too many corpses. No one smiled without apology. Villages were rebuilt with half their houses missing. Fields were cleared, though the boundary stones were forgotten. Churches reopened with new priests, their voices thinner, trembling through unfamiliar psalms. And though the bells began to ring again, they rang differently now, not in triumph, but in memory. Each chime a name, each echo a wound. In Italy, artisans returned to their workshops, but the faces they carved were gaunter now. Their saints no longer serene, but grieving. Painters turned their eyes away from heaven and began to study death, the blue lips, the grayed skin, the hollowed eye. Even angels wept now, draped in black, hovering not above glory, but over mass graves. The Renaissance had begun, but it was not a birth. It was a haunting. In France, widows took their husbands' land and did not give it back. In England, peasants refused to return to their lords, having buried the old world in the same soil as their kin. With so few left, labor had worth, and for the first time, a man might name his own price for the sweat on his brow. The world tilted. The orders of God and King bent under the weight of survival, and those who had once served now dared to ask why. The feudal chain had rusted, and in its cracks, rebellion would soon take root. But power did not vanish. It simply moved. The rich had fled. Now they returned, not with compassion, but with fear, building taller walls, wider manors, keeping distance from the poor who had nursed the sick and buried the dead. In the city squares, sumptuary laws were passed, forbidding the poor from dressing too finely, eating too richly, behaving too freely. The old world wanted control again. But the plague had taught people to remember their hunger. And hunger does not forget. In convents, some nuns painted skulls into the margins of their manuscripts, tiny memento mori hidden behind gilded vines. One monk carved a single line beneath his illuminated psalm. We who sing once sang with brothers, now we sing with ghosts. Birth returned, too, but quieter. Mothers no longer counted on survival. They kept swaddling cloth close, not to protect from cold, but to prepare for burial. Some children grew nameless for weeks, until the parents were certain they would live. The joy of life came now with a bitter aftertaste, like honey in a wooden cup cracked by flame. And yet, it came. A child's laugh broke the frost. A wedding candle burned in a newly built home. A song was heard, carried on the breeze, half forgotten, half invented. Life was not what it had been, but it was. And as the years turned, the memory of the Black Death began to shift, not into forgetting, but into myth. Some said it was a punishment. Some said it was the devil. Others whispered it was the world correcting itself, shaking off the weight of its overgrown population like fleas from a dying dog. But no one could say why it came, only that it had, and that it had changed everything. On the walls of a chapel in Lubeck, someone carved into the stone, "We who remain are not blessed. We are not chosen. We are only here." Chapter 8. The Watchers on the Edge. There were places the Black Death did not reach, small islands cradled by wind, mountain villages hidden in folds of stone, forests so thick, even the birds seemed to whisper instead of sing. They watched the sky change color. They saw the roads go empty, and still, the sickness did not come, not yet. In the Hebrides, the monks of Iona kept their silence. They heard no news, only the absence of travelers, The sea, once dotted with sails, now stretched. Wide and bare, each dawn, they walked the cliffs and looked eastward, toward the land of the dying. Their prayers grew longer, their fasts deeper, and when they broke bread, they did so without speaking. Was it mercy that spared them? Or had the shadow not yet reached that far, in Lapland? Reindeer herders marked the stars. They watched the patterns shift and whispered. Stories of a sky sickness moving across the world. One old woman tied feathers to her doorway. A prayer to the spirits of the snow. No wind has come from the south. She murmured, "Dot, and for now." That was enough. Even in Iceland, there was time to prepare, time to wonder. The merchants from Bergen stopped coming. The letters from Norway ceased. And still the frost arrived on schedule. The whales breached in the bay. The sheep gave birth in spring. And yet, something in the stillness felt wrong. As if the world had forgotten a sound. And the silence was a kind of scream. In the cities not yet touched, Prague, Moscow, Constantinople, people lit more candles. They shut their gates and watched the roads. Rumors fluttered like birds trapped in towers, that the dead walked. Again in Florence, that Venice burned its ships on the water, that no bell rang in Paris. Not for weeks. Some believed the disease would not cross mountains. Others said it could fly. None knew which was worse, the plague itself or the waiting. And then there were those who fled, not to escape, for none could outrun death, but to place distance between themselves and its breath. Noblemen rode to country estates. Students abandoned universities. Midwives, cooks, porters, messengers, all disappeared into the trees. But the shadow traveled faster than footsteps, and for every 10 who ran, 9 would turn their heads and see nothing. Then on the 10th day, they would smell it, the scent of rot in the leaves, and they would know they had brought it with them. But some were truly spared. Villages wrapped in stone and superstition. Islands whose tides shifted just enough to turn away the boats of the sick. And these people, in time, would rebuild faster. Their children would thrive. Their churches would fill again. And yet, a strange sadness lived beneath their skin. A kind of gentle guilt. The guilt of the untouched. For how do you live in a world reshaped by grief when your hands are clean? How do you look into the eyes of a man who has buried 7 brothers and say you were blessed? How do you sing when the music of the world has gone quiet? The watchers did not dance. They knelt. They whispered. They carved the names of cities they had never seen, now gone, into stone. To remember, to bear witness, to make their silence mean something. One girl from a village spared by the plague would later write, "When she was old and the world had mended, I remember no funerals. I remember no smoke, but I remember the wind, and how it carried nothing but the sound of distant weeping. The world had not ended, but something had, and those on the edge would carry that silence for the rest of their lives." Chapter 9, the scars beneath the skin. It had ended, at least that is what the world tried to tell itself. The bells rang again. The marketplaces reopened. Children played in the sun, but beneath the laughter, something had shifted. People looked over their shoulders more often. They knocked before entering familiar homes. They kissed their loved ones as if each embrace might be the last. Because now, they understood it could be. What the plague killed, it buried. But what it did not kill, it changed, and in that change lived the deepest wounds. In Florence, survivors painted skeletons on the walls of their homes, not in fear, but in reverence. In Paris, ballads were sung about the dance of death, a slow, spiraling parade in which kings and peasants alike were led by bony hands into the grave. And in Germany, woodcarvers etched scenes of pestilence into the lids of chests, into church altars, into the handles of knives, not to forget, but to remember, so that forgetting would not open the door again. People spoke differently now. The gaiety of innocence had gone. In its place came proverbs, short and sharp, like spells against fate. What God takes, no man can keep. Death walks on clean feet. Bathe your hands, and still you may fall. And they believed these things, not because they were true, but because truth had become unstable. Religion, once a constant star in the firmament, now flickered with doubt. How could God have allowed it? Had the prayers not been enough? Had the crosses carved into the doorposts not shone brightly, enough to ward him near? Some turned away from, The church whispering that perhaps it was not the voice of God they had followed, but the silence of men. Others turned toward it with more fervor than ever, whipping their backs raw with penance, convinced that suffering was the only holy language left, and some simply stopped speaking to heaven at all. Even time felt different. Before the plague, time had moved in circles, harvest to harvest, Easter to Easter. Now, it stretched like a thin wire, uncertain and fragile. People no longer planned their futures in decades. They spoke of weeks, perhaps seasons. A man who planted a tree no longer did so for his grandchildren, but for his own table, in case another storm came and wiped the world clean again. The old stories no longer satisfied. Knights slaying dragons felt irrelevant. Romances ended too neatly. Now the tales that traveled best were the ones where no hero won, where fate was indifferent, where survival itself was the only triumph. And in every village, you could find a man or woman who had once been cheerful, once been generous, once been known, and who now sat silently at the edge of gatherings watching, but never joining, because they had seen too much. Children born after the plague were different. They were quieter. At first, they cried less, laughed less, but watched everything. Their lullabies were darker. Their lullabies told stories of mothers who disappeared in the night, of winds that carried fever, of angels who sometimes turned away. And yet they grew, not in spite of the darkness, but within it, like seeds that crack open in the ash of fire. They were the first of a new world. And perhaps it is this that marks the deepest scar, the fact that life continued. It did not resume. It transformed. The plague had not just culled the body, it had cut into the soul of civilization and left it changed, stranger, colder, and more aware of its fragility. On a chapel wall in Aragon, a single word was scratched beneath the painted saints: still. Not saved, not alive, not even blessed. Just as still, still here, still walking, still remembering. Chapter 10, Whispers of Tomorrow. For a long time, there were no tomorrows. Only the slow turning of today. The rising and setting of a sun that seemed not to notice how many hearts it rose without. But eventually, time remembered how to move forward. And people did, too. The first signs were small. A child chasing a butterfly across an overgrown field. A widow hanging clean linen in the light. A mason whistling faintly as he chipped at stone. No proclamations marked the moment the world began again. There was no feast, no festival, no choir. Only quiet persistence, the kind of courage that doesn't shout. In the cities, new buildings rose, not replicas of the old, but structures with broader windows and lighter walls, as if even stone itself had learned to grieve and wanted now to let in more light. In the countryside, abandoned land grew wild. Wheat sprouted in old orchards. Goats wandered through empty manors. Life reclaimed what sorrow had left behind. And slowly, the old rhythm returned, not in full, but in fragments. But nothing was ever quite the same. People married younger. They told stories sooner. They wrote their names into the margins of books and walls and doors, as though afraid that, without a mark, the world might forget them too easily. Anew, art emerged, darker, sharper, but honest. Painters no longer avoided wrinkles or tears. Writers no longer sought neat endings. Truth had become more sacred than beauty. And even science, long the quiet servant of theology, began to stretch. People asked new questions. They studied sickness with suspicion, not just faith. They charted the stars not for omens, but for order. The world, in surviving, had learned not only to believe, but to ask. And from this asking, something unfamiliar began to bloom. Progress. There were still plagues, of course. In some cities, they returned with the seasons, like storms, less fierce, but still feared. Yet with every return, the response grew swifter. The hands that buried the dead now wore cloth soaked in vinegar. The bells rang warnings sooner. People had learned that knowledge, like faith, could be a shield. The scars had taught them, and they had listened. But not all learning was written in books. Some was etched in the soul. A man who had held too many dying hands might now linger longer in silence, watching the evening sky. A woman who had lost 5 children might sing lullabies to other mothers. Babes, her voice trembling with the weight of memory. Grief had become part of the architecture of life, like the stone steps worn down by 1,000 feet, shaped by sorrow but still standing. And with grief came grace. Neighbors learned to stay close, even when afraid. Strangers prayed for one another. A child's fever drew not panic, but community. Herbs brought, water boiled, stories told beside the firelight. The plague had carved through the heart of humanity. But what it revealed was not emptiness, it was tenderness in time. People stopped asking when the world would go back. They began to understand it could not, and it should not. Something new was being made, and it carried within it the memory of all that had been lost. One old man, near the end of his days, wrote a single sentence in the back of a book no one read anymore. If we must die, then let us love first, so that something of us lives. And in that quiet line, the future took root, not in monuments or victories, but in the choice to keep going, to plant, to care, to remember, to whisper tomorrow into the ashes of yesterday. Chapter 11. The return of light. At first, no one noticed the light returning. It came as it always does, in the slow stretch of days, the shy lengthening of shadows. But now, it felt different. As if the world, too, had endured a long night and was only just remembering how to open its eyes. The change wasn't in the sun, it was in the people. They walked slower, they listened longer, and when they laughed, it was quieter, not timid, but sacred, as though joy had become a form of prayer. In the churches, candles were lit not just for the dead, but for the living. In the marketplaces, vendors returned with bread and honey. Children watched with wide eyes as colors came back, not just in fruit and cloth, but in the faces of those who had once forgotten how to smile. And in the fields, the earth turned green again. Roots broke open the dirt like secrets whispered back into the world. In homes where silence had long reigned, voices began to echo once more. Stories were told, not of the plague, but of those who had survived it. A mother spoke of the brother who had carried her across a river. A son recalled the day his father came back from the edge of death with a pear in his pocket, saved just for him. A girl sang the lullaby her grandmother used to hum, even as the fever took her. These were not just stories, they were acts of defiance. To remember was to rebuild. Artists returned to their craft, but now their paintings had a different texture, not just grand saints and kings, but faces lined with grief and grace. Women holding sleeping babies, men planting seeds beside gravestones, lovers dancing with closed eyes, as though they had one night left in the world. The brush strokes were softer, the colors deeper, and in every corner of canvas, light. In villages once emptied by death, couples stood before priests again, hands clasped, not for grandeur, not for ceremony, but for hope. To say, we are still here, and we will keep going. A child born in this time of renewal was called Lucia, light. She did not know fear as her parents had. She did not wake at night listening for coughs or weeping. Instead, she knew the sound of bees in summer, the hush of snowfall, and the laughter of her mother when her father came home late with flour on his boots. Lucia would live a long life, and one day, when she was very old, she would whisper to her granddaughter, "We were not meant to be untouched. We were meant to survive, and to make something beautiful from what tried to break us." The world was not healed, but it was healing, and that was enough. The light, at last, had returned, not in triumph, but in truth. It said, "You remember, you endured, you remain." Chapter 12. What we carried, the plague has passed, not in the way a storm does, blowing through, then vanishing into the sky. No, the plague passed through us, and in doing so, it left something behind. Not all burdens are heavy. Some are small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, a habit, a gesture, a memory. This chapter is made of those. We carried the names, carved into stone, written in margins, whispered into twilight, the names of mothers and sons, of midwives and monks, of lovers lost and children unborn. Names never to be famous, but never truly gone. Each one a spark, passed from lips to wind. We carried silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of remembrance, the kind that settles in churches after the last hymn, the stillness of a room where no one dares disturb the air. Because something sacred once happened there. That silence lives on dot in a pause before a prayer, in a sigh as the wind changes, in the hush before the first snowfall. Dot we carried change. The Black Death altered everything, the way we lived, the way we prayed, the way we buried our dead and kissed our living. Dot it loosened the grip of kings. It gave voice to those once unheard. It forced medicine to become more than myth, and knowledge to grow sharper than fear. And so, without knowing, we carried the seeds of revolution. We carried caution. The old world had been sure of itself. But now we knew better. We learned that the smallest things, a cough, a flea, a touch, could undo empires. We learned that no city, no throne, no creed could shield us from the truth of our mortality. And though we danced again, we danced differently, with our eyes open, with our hands washed, with our hearts prepared to let go. And most of all, we carried love. Not the grand, golden kind sung by poets, but the quiet, enduring kind. The hand held at a bedside, the meal left on a doorstep, the prayer mumbled half asleep, for someone who might already be gone. We learned that love is not what keeps death away. It's what remains after. Centuries have passed. The bones of the plague lie deep beneath cities we now walk without fear. The fleas have fled. The marmots sleep unbothered. The riders of empire are long gone. But we still carry it, not the disease, but the lesson that life is not a promise, it is a gift. And so we live. We rise, we build, we teach our children not just how the plague came, but how we stayed. We tell them there was darkness, but we were not swallowed. We were shaped, and in our shaping, we became more than survivors. We became witnesses. We became rememberers. We became the thread that pulls tomorrow forward. And as you lie now in your bed, perhaps in quiet or with the low hum of the world beyond your window, know this: you are part of that thread. Your breath is another chapter. Your stillness, a kind of hymn. You are not alone. Not now, not ever. Sleep now. The dark has passed, and the light is yours to carry next. And until morning finds you again, may your dreams be light. May your breath be deep and easy. May the quiet hold you like a soft blanket around your heart. Let the memories of those who came before you settle gently like snow. Let the weight of the day melt from your shoulders. Let the hush of the world remind you you have already made it through. Rest now. Dear soul, you are safe, you are remembered, you are loved. Good night.